My name is Sue Dobson. I'm a professor here and also serve as Deputy Dean of the Business School. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the school and to the inaugural Diversity and Inclusion Seminar sponsored by the Business School here, but also Oxford's Wellcome Institutional Strategic Support Fund. The fund has enabled a series of seminars to be conducted, and we hope to have one of these each term. The seminars also feed into a research project led by myself and Professor Helen McShane to support the strategic goals of the university in relation to diversity and inclusion. And the lead researcher is Mahima Mitra, who's sitting here as well. So it gives me incredibly great pleasure to introduce Dame Sue Owen, who has so kindly agreed to be our first speaker for the first seminar. Dame Sue has just retired from the civil service, having led the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Support since 2013. She's been an academic economist. She joined the civil service, spending after 14 years at the Treasury. She's worked in the British Embassy in Washington, number 10, all over the place, and essentially at the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, she transformed the department from 320 to 1,300 people by taking on responsibility for telecoms, digital, data protection and charity sectors. She improved staff engagement from 45% to 70% and achieved the highest rating for an inclusive culture. And most recently, the department published the online harms white paper and the GDPR legislation. She has considerable experience of governance, making board chair appointments in a number of organisations. And she's pioneered diversity issues throughout her career, becoming the Civil Service Diversity and Inclusion Champion from 2015. So I can't think of anybody better to start off our series. So it's a great pleasure, and we're really looking forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here. As you say, I was the Civil Service Diversity and Inclusion Champion for 4 years. I was also the straight ally of the LGBT community of civil servants for longer than that. And I was also the special representative of short civil servants, which is why I'm going to stand here rather than behind the lectern, because then you wouldn't be able to see me. So as Sue said, my career has really been in 3 thirds. And in each of those thirds, I've been involved with diversity in some form or another. So I was an economist by training, and my research in the period when I was an academic was about the lifetime cost of being a woman compared to being a man in terms of lost earnings from working in lower paid occupations, part-time, career breaks, all that kind of thing, and looking at the implication of that for pensions. So if pensions are earnings related and you have lower lifetime earnings, you're baking in disadvantage into retirement. And it was that work really that led me to come into the civil service, because the government were quite interested in that and whether the state pension should be earnings related or flat rate. One of the reasons it's flat rate is so that is less of a disadvantage to women than men. So the second third of my career, I was in that building mainly in the Treasury. And the third of my career, I was in more leadership roles, which I characterise as roles where everybody working for you knows more than you about any particular thing, but you're the person who knows the big thing. And as Sue said, I'm just starting on the 4th third of my career. These are the departments I worked in. So it's quite common now for permanent secretaries, heads of department to have worked in several departments. Not all as many as me, but it is good to have worked in policy roles, in delivery roles, corporate roles, and so on. So I thought I would tell you a bit today about how the civil service has been doing on diversity and inclusion, what its strategy is, and a little bit more detail at the end about, in particular, what we've been doing about bullying and harassment. But I can answer questions on, if you want to pick up in more detail on any parts at the end. So just a little bit of a kind of overview of what does the civil service look like. In the latest data that we collected in 2018, we compare ourselves with the working population, and you can see that on gender, we are, if anything, overrepresented in the civil service, nearly 54% female. On ethnic minority background, we're just about proportionate, but we're a bit underrepresented on disability. And we just don't have good enough data on sexual orientation because a lot of people won't declare. They won't even say, prefer not to say. So we don't usually put our data on LGBO there. Then we look at the leadership grades, that's the senior civil service, and you can see that we're now nearly 45% of senior civil servants are women, but we're desperately underrepresented for people with an ethnic minority background or disabled, and that hasn't changed at all. But on gender, we have made a lot of progress. So the year I joined the senior civil service, 1995, we were 16% female, and now we're 44% female. So the dial really has shifted quite dramatically in respect of gender. Doesn't mean we haven't still got problems on gender, but we feel in the civil service that the focus now needs to be much more on upping the proportions of people from non-white backgrounds or people who have some kind of disability. It doesn't mean that over the whole civil service things are the same. So once you start to look and break it down by individual departments, so we look at the proportion in the most junior grades, AO, the more clerical grades, and look at the proportion who are female going up to the senior civil service, you can see on the right-hand side, the civil service as a whole, in the most junior grades is more female than male, and in the more senior grades is now only a little bit more male than female. So you've got that sort of forceps kind of pattern that crosses over, and that differs in different departments. So happily in my own department in DCMS, we have more women than men in any grade. The Treasury, quite an interesting one actually, because once you get to the sort of, there aren't many people in the two most junior grades there, but it's relatively flat in the Treasury, so they're doing quite well. Department of Work and Pensions, a massive delivery organisation, 80,000 people, very, very female in the mass of roles, which are processing roles, customer service roles, job centre kind of roles. And then you can see Ministry of Defence, complete basket case, more men than women in every grade. But there we go. So I think what this shows is that it's really important to collect data. And that's something that we've been doing much more intensively in the civil service, I would say, over the last decade now, collecting data from administrative sources, but also from survey sources. And once you start to collect these kind of data by department, and once you start then to show the senior leaders in the departments sort of how they are relative to others. I mean, it's not like we're competitive or anything, but nobody wants to be like the MOD. So I don't know whether you're doing that in the university, but if you're not, you should. Just start to get this kind of information that you're regularly looking at, and that you can, I mean, certainly in the civil service, we now, as I think throughout the last 5 years, the appraisals of the permanent secretaries always have a kind of section of them about how your department is doing on diversity and inclusion. So just a little word about the very top grades, the permanent secretary grade. So there are 19 government departments, but there are 38 people who have permanent secretary rank when you include Chief Medical Officer and MI5 and MI6 and all the various other GCHQ and Chief scientist. There are 38 people who have that status and who may attend the regular Wednesday morning meeting of permanent secretaries. And about 2 or 3 years ago, a colleague and I decided to look at how many women permanent secretaries there had ever been. And the first one, Dame Evelyn Sharp, was appointed in 1955, which is the year I was born. By the time I went to university in 1973, there had been 3. And by the time I joined the civil service in 1989, there had been 5. So we did a list. It turned out I'm number 26, and we're up to now 40. So we're kind of catching up. But we did have a get-together a couple of years ago where we found that 28 of the then 37 were still alive, and we got 24 of them together. So there we are. And there's the former president, is it President Morrill? There, Moira Wallace in the front row, and the Master of Balliol, Helen Ghosh, is there. So those were us, and this portrait is now in the National Portrait Gallery, and it's called The Secretaries. There's some really amazing women in there. Stella Rimington next to me on the front row, first female head of MI5, and Eliza Manningham Buller next to her, the second female head of MI5. There's never been one in MI6, and several departments have still not had a woman permanent secretary. So we're getting there on gender, but a little bit way to go yet. So a few words, I think, now about why has diversity and inclusion become important in the civil service. So some of us, like me, have been kind of banging on about this for a long time, and occasionally some of the top people would make a little bit of an effort, and then it would all sort of die away again. But the thing that I think has really shifted the dial, particularly as the civil service has shrunk over the years, is the kind of realization that actually if you have a workforce that is representative of the population you serve, you are going to make better policy, you are going to deliver better customer service, and if people feel valued and included at work, they're going to perform better. So there's McKinsey research about the private sector that shows that companies who have, certain, I think 25 or 30% diversity in the top executive levels actually make more money in the private sector. In the civil service, it's that kind of realization that we are going to make better policy. So it's not particularly about gender or ethnicity. It's about having a variety of people who are making important decisions as well. So I would say that Sir Jeremy Hayward, the former Cabinet Secretary, who sadly died a year ago, I mean, Jeremy kind of he only really got it when he started to think about the business case about 4 years ago. So moving on a bit now to thinking a little bit not just about the kind of diversity of the civil service, but thinking a bit more about inclusion and engagement and how people feel about their work, and do they feel valued, and are they therefore going to perform well. We have a staff survey which we do in October. We've been doing it every year now for over a decade. And we don't yet have the 2019 results. So this is the latest data that there are. And the overall engagement score is the kind of figure that we kind of look at. And the sort of average is in 2018 was 62%. But that's, people feeling proud to work where they do. They'd be proud to tell others what work they do. They feel motivated by their work, that kind of thing. So interestingly, we don't see a lot of difference on kind of male, female. We do see a little bit of, quite a big difference on some of the gender identity measures that we've introduced recently. Obviously, there are some quite small numbers there, but You can see that people who identify in another way feel a lot less engaged with their work. But there's some very interesting things in the rest of this slide. So our colleagues with an ethnic minority background actually feel very engaged with their work. They really like being in the civil service. There's not much difference on sexual orientation, but there's a very big and worrying difference on disability, and some interesting small differences there on faith as well, with Muslim colleagues feeling very engaged with their work. So we worry about this slide, particularly about the disability, because we're not getting the best from our disabled colleagues. They're feeling less engaged and more unhappy at work. Again, we get quite a bit of difference across departments. So the top line there is the Department for International Development. Everybody in DFID loves their work. They always have. They love working for reducing world poverty, but you can see there's no trend there. It's been flat at around 72-73% over the whole time we've been collecting the data. The fat line is the civil service average, and happily that's been drifting slightly upwards. What's the yellow line? So the yellow line is work and pensions. This is a very difficult department to engage because 80,000 staff, most of them are out of London, running call centres or processing centres or job centres. But they've done incredibly well, actually, to increase their level of staff engagement. And even HMRC, I mean, it's quite difficult to motivate people because in DWP, you can say, you're helping people out of poverty and helping them stay out of poverty, and that's really motivating. But collecting taxes is more difficult thing to jump out of bed for. But what they say is collecting the money to spend on the good things. So they've done very well. And happily, the Nike tick is my department, DCMS, where we're, and so we should be, because it's enriching lives and driving growth, that department. So, but we in our leadership of departments, we worry a lot about these scores and these trends, and how our staff are feeling. So moving on then to sort of a kind of other aspects that we get from the staff survey. So the experience of bullying and harassment. So we've been collecting these data for over a decade, and if anything, this has slightly ticked up recently. It's been 10 to 11% for 10 years. Last year it came in at 12% overall, but you can see, again, we've got the big difference on disability. 22% of disabled staff, that's over 1 in 5, feeling bullied and harassed at work. And here we see a difference opening up on sexual orientation, with LGBO colleagues feeling more bullied and harassed, even though on engagement there wasn't a lot of difference. So that's a worry. And then we have another question about inclusion and fair treatment. And again, we see the same patterns reflected, that our disabled staff feel very excluded relative to staff who don't declare a kind of disability. So taking all this together, we put together a diversity and inclusion strategy a couple of years ago with kind of 2 elements. So we had the kind of representation, the diversity element of it, which, as I said, has been very much about not to ignore gender and sexual orientation, but the focus is going to be on disabled staff and staff with an ethnic minority background, getting them into the senior civil service. That's the focus there. But the other part of the strategy is very much about inclusion, and that's focusing on everybody, and how can we get everybody to feel more valued and included at work. We've got this overall strategy. There's been lots of kind of interviews and that kind of data. We pick up kind of comments like this kind of thing about the sort of behaviours that kind of senior people don't see but are going on in departments. So particularly in the wake of the Me Too movement, we felt, and the fact that our bullying and harassment scores haven't shifted for so long, we felt we should do a bit more of an in-depth piece of work about bullying and harassment in the civil service. So that was kind of, in my last year, that was one of the things that I led, and we got a lot of, we got all the data that we collect from departments about grievances and that kind of thing. We also took all the data from the staff surveys that I've shown you, and we did a one-off survey. So in the annual People survey, 11-12% report bullying and harassment, but in our special survey, 72% of the respondents said they had experienced it at least once, and nearly half more than once. Now, obviously, there was some sample selection bias here because you were more likely to fill in the survey if you had experienced bullying and harassment. But nevertheless, it did give us a bit more kind of a rich theme of what it was, the kind of how people feel when they have been bullied and harassed. And some of the text comments were some of the most interesting. So one of the things we picked up was that people are very reluctant to report bullying and harassment, particularly where a manager is involved. They feel it's unsafe to challenge. Lots of barriers to speaking up. People feel there'll be kind of personal repercussions. They're not confident that their concerns will be addressed. They've mentioned it before and nothing was done. The processes are very kind of bureaucratic. So those were coming up very strongly. People also are kind of wanting something more explicit about what behaviours they could expect at work, and they wanted better experience when they do complain, and also for people who complained about, they want a better experience for them as well. So, you know, some people, where there's a complaint against them, they may have been suspended, and that may be for months, and then the complaint isn't upheld, and the whole thing's very stressful. And people also feel there's been kind of lots of talk where they haven't actually seen any kind of action around it. Now, this was a very important one that came out. It was a very clear distinction between abusive and abrasive behaviour. So abusive behaviour, where somebody is a bully, they know they are, they don't care, they intended to have the impact they've had. Whereas abrasive behaviour is the kind of personal style which people, they feel bullied by that style, but the kind of perpetrator has no idea of the impact that they are having. And I think this, certainly in the leadership of the civil service, this was really important distinction, because very few people feel they're abusive. But are they ever abrasive? You know, are you ever abrasive at home? Probably yes, sometimes. And just understanding the impact that can have. So one of the things that we found was that quite a lot of bullying and harassment is at middle management levels. It's not at very senior levels. It's kind of middle managers shouting at people just who are more junior than them, you know, just get that effing photocopying done now, I need it in 20 minutes. Whereas if they'd said, I'm feeling a bit stressed, I'm just seeing the minister in 20 minutes, can you help me? Totally different impact. So we actually felt this was quite a rich theme, actually, because by highlighting that the kind of abrasive behaviour, it sort of ought to be a bit of an easy win, really, in encouraging people to say when they feel that behaviour has been abrasive, and then it's quite easy for someone to do something and try and adjust that kind of behaviour. So that was very important. So in the permanent secretary community, you know, there was kind of actions about closing this credibility gap between saying what we're going to do and actually doing it. Definitely a commitment to have better processes. People wanted sort of more independent processes for reporting bullying, not necessarily through HR. So some departments are experimenting with sort of fair treatment ambassadors who are staff who are kind of separate from HR, that they can go to some quite interesting apps being developed. So apps where you can, it's quite important if you've been bullied to record it, because no good saying 2 years' time, or 2 years ago this happened, if you've actually written it down when it happened. And there are some apps now where you can write it down, and there are little options like report it, don't report it, or only report it if 3 other people have complained about this same person, sort of bringing a kind of class action element to it. And that's really quite powerful, because typically if you have a bully around, it's not just you, there'd probably be other people involved as well. There's also some work going on about trying to build more positive work, building more inclusive cultures, looking at organisations where staff do feel included, what are the kind of characteristics of those organisations, that people should feel they belong, that there's some sort of, they're able to be themselves at work, where they have a say. And then the sort of departments, there are these kind of things here about these are the departments who have these characteristics tend to have better scores on inclusion. Things that I found worked for me at DCMS, where we had the best score on inclusion in Whitehall, were kind of more simple things. So the six-handed woman is all about valuing all the skills that people have. So, I always used to say to some of the more junior staff, the women usually, if you can get Christmas dinner on the table by 2 o'clock with 8 different hot vegetables and everyone in the room, likelihood is you're good at project management. Have you thought of applying for a project management job? If you can deal with squabbling children, you're probably quite good at dealing with special advisors. So encouraging people to sort of bring all their life skills to work, rather than just the kind of little narrow lot of skills that they think are used in their job, is a good way of making everyone, people feeling more valued. In DCMS, we had an explicit written down no blame culture. So this was, in medicine, you want a no blame culture. If you've accidentally given someone the wrong drugs, you want that person to say they've done that. And what we found at DCMS, we didn't have enough staff to do anything twice. So everybody had to take responsibility at every grade for their work, knowing that it was unlikely to be checked before it went up. Which is good for people because it means they have more responsibility. But they need to know that if something goes wrong, they're not going to have lots of finger pointing and that kind of thing. So we had a very explicit, written down, no blame culture. And that worked very well. And I always used to tell ministers that, if something went wrong, I would tell them straight away. And they weren't to go and shout at individuals because they wouldn't even know who it was. So that was good. We did a lot of work on mental health and talking about that and having people understand that kind of periods of mental ill health are just normal. Understanding that people with some conditions will need different kinds of arrangements to others. If you're bipolar, you may suddenly need a week off. Just a lot more work on that we found was very successful at improving feelings of inclusion. And the other thing that we did in terms of trying to kind of value everyone was thinking about having a variety of people in your teams and in your grades. So this at the end is what the heart of what diversity is about, is having diversity of thought. So just simple things like looking at the team around you and maybe doing one of these Myers-Briggs things, you will find out whether you have got a diverse set of thinking. So INTJ is the one that says be polite, be courteous, be professional, and have a secret plan to kill everyone in the room. When the Treasury did this back in 1996, they found that 90% of the leaders were INTJ. So that explains a lot about the British system. But you do need that variety of thought to avoid kind of groupthink. So, and if you have that kind of variety of thought and variety of background, you know, you've achieved some diversity, and you've probably achieved some inclusion as well. So that's all I'm going to say. I'll leave you with my last slide, and happy to answer any questions.
Such a rich presentation and lots of good things to try out in our own organisation, so thank you. So questions, please. I think we've got a microphone coming around for anybody's got a question. Thank you. Do you want to say who you are before you ask the question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alia. I'm a current MBA student. I think something that concerns me is whenever I go to events about diversity, this is actually one of the most male-filled audiences I've ever seen. So thank you to all the men in the audience.
Yeah, thank you,
because I often find that it ends up only being women or minorities that go. So I guess my question to you is, how do you try to bring more people into the conversation, particularly those who can affect change?
Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think certainly in the civil service, what we did was certainly looking at the data a lot. Things like the Chilcot inquiry, where there was evidence of, you know, entrenched groupthink, people surrounded by people like them only thinking one way. The more that you can have those kinds of examples of where it would have made it would have been a benefit to have had a wider variety of people thinking about that problem. So, you know, I don't know this, but I expect that if you think of something like Grenfell, I suspect that there are not many people in the government department that deals with that kind of housing who live in that kind of accommodation. You know, might things like that have been spotted a bit earlier if we'd had a greater variety of people? Possibly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just to the back there, thank you.
My name is Philip George. To be provocative, there's never been a worse time to be a white, middle-class, university graduate in the civil service. What do you say?
Oh, we've heard that one very often. Yes. That is why the strategy that we had in the civil service had this very important pillar about inclusion. It's about everybody feeling included. So I wouldn't worry.
Okay, thank you. Just down here, if that's all right. Thank you. And I'll come across.
Thank you. My name is Yasuo Nakatani. My question is relationship with a politician, because civil servants should have consistency even something happen. But recently, if you look at the politician, they try to do something, funny things, talking about how to adapt them. And in that case, the diversity can better way to react their behaviors.
Well, the diversity of our parliament is up to the electorate, and not just that, but also up to, the people who stand and the political parties. So there's not a lot I as a civil servant can do about that. I am very worried personally that the next parliament will be significantly less female than the last one. And I think that is a worry for everyone.
Thank you. There's a hand over here. Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name is Kaya Makubu, and I'm also an MBA at the Syed School. My question is around the leadership in the sort of the last rung, and around how, from a representation perspective, it's still very white, male, straight, and able-bodied. What initiatives or strategies can you suggest from a professional development perspective, if that's the answer, or getting rid of unconscious biases to maybe get more people that are diverse minorities in leadership?
Oh, that's a big and good question. So in the permanent secretary level, you know, the top 38, there are several gay people, but only one is out. So it's the kind of all the kind of normal social questions that we've got there. We do have some hidden disabilities as well, and again, you know, people don't always declare those. I think the one I'm most worried about is on ethnic minority background. So, you know, I talked about the fact that there only ever been now 40 women permanent secretaries. Of those, 2 were not white. You saw them in the picture there. One of them stayed in her job for 3 years, and the other one for 1 year. So we didn't get very much of them. And there's only ever been 1 male non-white permanent secretary, Suma Chakrabarti, and that is a real worry for us. So the kind of strategy about how can we do something about this? You know, there's a combination of can we try and do anything quickly, and in the meantime, we should also be kind of growing our pipeline. So we've seen from the very first slide I showed you, we're not short of ethnic minority people in the civil service. We are representative overall, but they're not coming through into the senior grades. So we definitely need to be doing more on kind of growing our own. And you know, the fact that more women have come through, we haven't brought through the non-white women as well. So that kind of intersectionality, the kind of pull hasn't happened. So, you know, there's a lot of the issues are similar to the ones that we faced with women. You know, confidence, there's a bit of lack of aspiration, but there's also stuff about fear of failing and not wanting to apply and then not get through. So a lot of that we will be doing the same as we did with gender, and thinking about the composition of panels. We know certainly in the civil service, if you are doing promotions and you do them one at a time, you don't get as diverse an outcome as if you do them in batches. So if you do like 6 or 10 at a time, you will get a much more diverse outcome. Making sure the panels are diverse. What is incredibly successful is including on panels a more junior person than the job being recruited to. The more junior people are much better at spotting the good leaders. So we do that quite often for permanent secretary roles. Everybody now has to do a kind of staff panel beforehand. They don't always appoint the favourite, but you know, it's a good thing to do. So there's a lot of work like that, but that is a slower burn. Then there's kind of directly hiring people in from outside, but everybody's trying to do this now. I mean, we've had some success, but not a lot. So I think we're not going to shift the dial in like 2 years, but I would hope that we can shift it within 4 or 5 years.
Okay, thank you. I think colleague up now, thank you.
This is on. Hi, I'm Candice. I'm one of the MBA students as well. I had 2 questions. My first question was, I recently read an article from the Harvard Business Review that said that diversity and inclusion obviously is very difficult work, and it mentioned that the need, in order for people of color, LGBTQ, disabled people to feel really welcome within certain communities, is to have like a reorganization and transformation of the cultures of certain environments. So I wanted you to comment on, has there been any cultural change within the civil service here in the UK? My second point is, what would your thoughts be around a national diversity and inclusion index, where an organization goes around and basically measures the success for every organization, major organization or corporation, on their efforts towards diversity and inclusion as well as their success?
Well, on the latter question, I would definitely support that. I think that'd be a very good idea. I mean, the Government Equalities Office runs the sort of the kind of policy for the country as a whole on these issues. But there are private sector outfits that are doing things too. I mean, certainly on gender, there have been things like the Hampton-Alexander Review looking at boards and that kind of thing. So, you know, if we got to the stage where companies were competing with each other for how they were doing on these kinds of issues, that would be a good place to be at. But again, that is, you know, do companies hire board members for their expertise on diversity and inclusion? I can tell you from personal experience, no. It's always seen as an add-on, but you know, if you got to the place where that kind of business case were recognised, and there were some, I mean, you know, we are having now more reporting of the gender pay gap, for example. If there were a kind of more indices, that can only be a good thing. Is there a culture change in the civil service? I think at the top, the culture is changing. And as I say, I mean, I was the overall champion and the straight ally of the LGBT plus community. There was also a faith champion, disability champion, gender, and so on. So that was good. I mean, we had, you know, half a dozen of the top people also going out, doing speeches every week, that kind of thing. Where there was more problem, I would say, was in the kind of middle. So, you know, I didn't find much homophobia in London. But when you would go to a pension processing centre in Newcastle, that is where you would find people talking about, oh, I don't see why they should have time to go to that meeting or that march or whatever. So the kind of appreciation that having people who feel valued and included at work, whatever their differences, what was good for performance hasn't kind of filtered through to that kind of middle kind of level.
Okay, thank you. Please.
I'm Sarah Beck, I'm the Chief Operating Officer here. I wondered if any thought, particularly around inclusion, went towards the structure of the civil service and the grades and the hierarchy that exists, and how you can be truly inclusive if you have that kind of structure in the way people are working.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, the organisation has got quite a lot flatter over the years. And most people think that's a good thing. There are other people who actually feel having more rungs that you can reward people with is helpful. But in general, it's gotten a lot flatter. And certainly now, I mean, as I said, in my own department, you don't have pieces of work going through every level. I mean, work is done and it goes to where it goes up to the top. So, I mean, if you're thinking of the kind of structure of departments, we do have changes from time to time, but the broad structure is much the same, and that's as much dictated by having, you know, people in cabinet who want to have their area of responsibility rather than a much bigger kind of department. But I mean, I don't know whether there's research on whether flatter organisations are better at diversity. Is there? Yeah.
Actually, there is. My partner and I recently supervised an MSc project at Cambridge, and it was a Peruvian guy. Sorry, my name's Ruth. We recently co-supervised, and he had done some really good research on top indexed financial companies. He'd compared South Africa and the USA, that's what he had access to data from, and he showed that the companies with the narrowest executive pay gap performed the best on several different metrics, but especially on their actual success as a company in that ranking system that they were measured by.
Please, I think up there. You put it on this side.
Dr. Moyes, tutor of comparative philosophy. I liked very much that ontological distinction between diversity as a mix and inclusion as making the mix working. When you do inclusion, where do you lay the emphasis on empowering people, vulnerable people, to be performant, or just to select them because they are a minority?
Well, we don't select people just because they're a minority. I mean, we select people based on merit, but we know, everybody has merit. It's whether you can demonstrate your merit. So, I think in the civil service, we've shown we can improve on gender, and I know that we can improve on all these other factors as well. On the more, on the kind of bigger point about inclusion, I mean, for me, it's very much a leadership issue, and it is the role of ultimately the top leader, but to set the tone so that at all leadership kind of levels, you have people who have the ability to value everybody, so that everybody does feel included.
Thank you. I've just got one down here and then we'll come. Thank you. Helen.
Hi, Helen McShane from Medical Sciences. You showed quite a difference between different departments, which is interesting, and one might imagine the different departments and divisions in the university have differences as well. Was there any attempt to share best practice, learn lessons, disseminate from those departments that were doing well to those that were perhaps a little more resistant?
Well, yes. So every department does have its own kind of culture, which seems to transcend whoever's in it, and certainly whoever the minister is. The Foreign Office is kind of relaxed and elegant. It always has been. It probably always will be. And a lot of it there is to do with the way that people's careers are planned, and everybody in the Foreign Office makes it to, there are enough countries in the world that most people become an ambassador, whether they're in the big fish in a very small pond or the big fish in a very big pond, sort of doesn't matter, because you will get there. So it actually, everybody feels more relaxed. Other departments are more kind of grasping, like the Treasury. The Treasury actually is a very young department and with alarmingly high rate of turnover, probably 25%. So there are these different cultures, but you can do something about them. And then when you have new departments, I mean, my department was only 25 years old, so you're starting a new kind of culture then. Definitely learning from each other. So just collecting these data and comparing them, and people are then saying, what did you do, and so we do have quite a lot of that kind of, and going to speak in different departments and that kind of thing, but it's still quite a challenge. If you've got the Home Office is a very embedded, not very good culture, I think I'm all right to say that. That is quite a difficult one. But I showed you the slide of work and pensions. I mean, they've done remarkably well to improve their culture, and also in HMRC. So, it can be done, but it does require the very senior people to feel this is their job, and their job is not. It's not just advising ministers on policy. There's usually plenty of people who can do that. It is the job of the senior leaders to get the best out of everyone. And in DWP, they had a very big discrete effort on this with people going out to job centres every month and that kind of thing, talking to the local leaders. And then, of course, you've got a lot of benefits coming back, because the more the very senior people go out to meet the local people, they give you ideas back again. And they'll say, oh, by the way, that thing you introduced the other day, I tell you now that's not going to work. And so then you'd come back and say, oh, you know, it looks like that's not going to work, let's change it. Whereas if you hadn't done that, that wouldn't happen. So the quality of leadership is really, really important. We had, I'll give you one example. When I worked in work and pensions, we had 32 benefit processing centres, and the leaders of these are quite junior ranked people, and we knew the cost per benefit payment of the average cost per centre, and it was during the 2010 I won't say cuts, reductions, and we knew we would have to close the 5 worst performing benefit processing centres, and the worst performing one, the guy running it got wind of this and left, and his deputy, a woman, became the leader, and within 1 year it was the best performing benefit processing centre. Only one thing changed. Everybody felt more included, they felt, you know, so it actually shows that kind of leadership, feelings of inclusion, can affect the bottom line.
Very good, thank you. Well,
Hi, good evening. Mohammed Patel from NHS. Hello, good evening. I have 3 questions disguised as one. The first question is, I work as the head of equality and inclusion within the NHS. Do they have similar roles within the service? First question. Second question, how well are they resourced? And finally, what kind of equality and diversity training is offered to the civil service? I think that's the end of my question.
Okay, well, I don't know about the NHS, but you know, I do know that Matt Hancock cares quite a bit about this sort of thing. So if the NHS don't have it, hopefully it's coming. Well, I think on the training, I think it's quite difficult, really. I mean, I don't approve of just sending everyone on a sort of sheep dip kind of D&I training thing, you know, or some online training or that kind of thing. On the other hand, some of those things can be helpful in showing people their unconscious biases. Everybody has unconscious biases, and some of those kinds of online resources can be quite helpful in revealing that. I mean, personally, I think that the best thing is to give people some leadership responsibility for diversity and seeing how they get on with it. Actually, having it as part of their appraisal is a good thing. So, you know, we now know, for example, the bullying and harassment scores down to units of 20 people. And within an organisation, you know the ones who've got the highest scores. Those people know they've got high scores. They know people are going to be watching whether they're doing anything about it. So I think that kind of confronting with people with data, I mean, sometimes some training can be helpful. So with a lot, I think on disability and on sexual orientation, there's a lot of ignorance and people just don't know what to do. So on disability, having some kind of learning about, you know, what is bipolar, what is the right way to help someone like that, you know, to be understanding, some kind of mental health first aider training about what to do if someone is standing on the roof about to jump off. Those sorts of things, I think that's good. On Stonewall runs some very good sort of seminars where they will come in and do a kind of 3-hour thing where they will give you, you know, a group of maybe 20, 25 people, and they'll show you a kind of a situation that a gay person finds very upsetting, and then they'll talk through how you might address it. You know, if you've got a little group of people who are laughing in a corner because a man is wearing a pink shirt, you know, the leader doesn't always know how to grip that. So actually, some training, that sort of practical kind of training about how to address particular situations, or about how to tell someone that they are being seen as a bully. Those sorts of practical help, I think, is better than, just the sort of more legal type of thing.
Last question, I think, at the back there. Sorry, I think it's running out of time here. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Dami. I'm an MBA student at the school. My question is whether there has been any work done on neurodiversity, that's people who are neuroatypical or have cognitive or learning, disorder. Are they included in the workforce?
Absolutely, yes. That's a very, very good question. We definitely need people, certainly in the civil service, but everywhere, across the whole range. I think if you go to an area which has done a lot of work on this is GCHQ, where if you had an index of neurodiversity, they would score very highly on that. I mean, there's some very brainy people there. So definitely there is, we don't have a good measure of it, but there is an appreciation that we need that whole kind of range of skills, really.
Okay, I think I've been told that time is up. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody here for a really insightful conversation. I think it's given us an awful lot to think about. One of the things that we want from this seminar series is sharing good practice around the university. So we'll run another of these seminars next term, but do feel free to kind of contact me with ideas, and perhaps we can use it as a way of sharing across the departments, because I think you're right. One of the things is we're not very good at sharing good practice. So I think if we can use this event and this kind of network to begin to do that, we might begin to have a community of learning within the university that might be really helpful. So I can't thank you enough for kicking that off. Thank you.